I want to give a quick introduction to shamanism and then go over some of the readings for this week. They're very important, but they can be a little difficult to work with, so I do want to just give you some kind of guidance in terms of the readings by Iliadi. So we can see here in this image, this is a photograph of a Korean shaman. And so shamans are what Iliadi calls technicians of the sacred, and they're probably, we speculate, if not the oldest, one of the oldest forms of both religious specialist and healer. So right from the beginning, we see this very tight connection between people who are religious specialists, but also acting as healers. Now, the kind of cluster of characteristics and techniques that shamans use can be seen across culture. And shamans can be male or female. In some cultures, they're only male. In some cultures, they're only female. In this case, in Korea, the shamans tend to be female. In Japan, they also tend to be female. In Siberia, they tend to be male. It just depends. But nonetheless, these characteristics remain. And so I also want to make it really clear that this is not something from the ancient past. These practices are alive and well. And as I mentioned last time, really, we find them all the time wherever somebody is practicing some kind of healing, because human beings have not changed in their basic mental and physical, emotional makeup. So these techniques, we see them into the present. The definition of shamanism that I'm using here is taken from David Kinsley in his work, Health, Healing, and Religion. And he writes that shamanism is one of the most archaic and common type of healers. The shaman is the master of the soul. He, she has the ability to undertake soul travel, to roam the spirit world where lost souls often travel. The shaman has direct access to the spirit world. He, she can go there, can communicate directly with spirits, and often has acquired a helping spirit or ally that lends healing powers. So this is the idea that certain individuals have a particularly close relationship with the spirit realm. And we see this in our own culture with spirit mediums. Some of you may be familiar with psychics and spirit mediums. They'll often talk to the dead. Some of you may be familiar with the program Long Island Medium, or have gone to one in your life. They're actually much more common than anybody admits. Certainly they used to come around to our neighborhood when I was a kid, and all the women would go to the psychic. A very important aspect of shamanism is the idea of initiation, so that one is called to become a shaman. So on page 6 of your course pack, Iliadi writes, more or less pathological sicknesses, dreams, and ecstasies we have seen so many means of reaching the condition of shaman. Sometimes these singular experiences signify no more than a choice from above and merely prepare the candidate for new revelations, but usually sicknesses, dreams, and ecstasies in themselves constitute an initiation. So I was at a conference a number of years ago, and there was a Russian scholar there that had done research with Siberian shamans, and he said the idea is it's a bit like the mafia. When you're called, you have to answer. It's considered to be very dangerous to turn away from a calling to be a shaman. And so it's interesting to me to see this idea of a calling, and I will be looking at this when we get to the section on Western biomedicine and the Hippocratic Oath. So I think we all instinctively recognize that there are certain occupations that aren't just jobs, they're callings. We actually use those words still, luckily. And just to give an example from our time period right now, we can see that healthcare workers very clearly are acting from a sense of calling. I know, for instance, in North Bay, the woman who's responsible for the rollout of the vaccines was just about to retire, but instead of retiring, leapt into the fray and has been doing an absolutely amazing job in making sure that all of us get vaccinated. And so it's very clear to me that people like that in nursing, in biomedicine, in all forms of healing, often come from a deeper place of that what they're doing is much more than a job. What is happening? Another very important characteristic of the shaman is the idea of the shaman as wounded healer. So somebody who has suffered a life-threatening illness, and alongside this is the idea that a wounded healer can feel empathy. So many of us can obviously feel sympathy regarding somebody who's suffering, but the wounded healer has been through the experience themselves and so feels empathy. The wounded healer also offers hope that the illness can be healed. So within their person, they offer this example of somebody who has overcome a very serious illness. And so we'll see this figure as we move through the course. There's going to be a number of people that we look at who embody this archetype. The wounded healer is also at home in the world of illness and death, or as Eliade said, knows the geography of death and is not afraid of it. So the vast majority of people are extremely afraid of both illness and death and often don't want to talk or think about it. So the idea is that the wounded healer is somebody who's gone ahead and had these experiences and has returned and is not afraid, and so can offer solace, reassurance, and hope. So building on that idea of knowing the geography of the underworld, I want to start looking at initiatory dreams of the Samoyed shamans on page 9 of the course pack. And so this is an account given of a shaman who was unconscious for a number of days and then recounted the visions that he had while he was unconscious as a result of smallpox. So we're told that he was given animal guides. And so an ermine and a mouse. And so I'm giving a picture of a ermine here. And I happened to see one on campus last year. I was absolutely amazed to see one right near the pond behind Nipissing. So this is a very interesting idea as well, that the shaman is very close to the animal world and often has an animal ally or guide. And I've asked my students in the past to think about whether or not we have something to learn from animals. And I think this is a very important thing to think about in Western culture. If you come from Western culture, the way that we view animals is highly problematic. And for me, it's not difficult at all to think of animals as medicine and that they offer certain types of teachings. Anybody who has animals in their life or is close with animals will be able to tell you this. So what you can learn from, for example, a cat, I'll just give an example from my own life. There's so many things, but how to relax, how to sleep with great aplomb, how to have fun with very day-to-day items. There are so many things we learn from nature and from the animal world. And so we can see that these healers have this very, very intimate relationship with animals, but also one of great humility. So the fact that the animal is the guide, it's not the human being. Before I start working in detail with the reading, I just want to talk a little bit about the idea of the geography of the underworld. So as you go through the reading, you'll note there are many, many landscapes that are being described. So the initiate, the candidate, as is said in the reading, has to move through these various landscapes, and they're incredibly symbolically rich. And we know across the world's traditions, we find these kind of allegorical landscapes of mountains being important, oceans, desert, and so on. And so, unsurprisingly, we find it in these shamanic narratives. So on page 9 on the right-hand side, we're told that the Lord of the Underworld then gave him 2 guides, an ermine and a mouse, to lead him to the underworld. When they came to a high place, the guide showed him 7 tents with torn roofs. He entered the first, and there found the inhabitants of the underworld and the men of the great sickness, syphilis. These men tore out his heart and threw it in a pot. In other tents he met the Lord of Madness and the Lord of all the nervous disorders, as well as the evil shamans. Thus he learned the various diseases that torment mankind. So we find this idea of him actually meeting illnesses, and the illnesses are personified as gods or as spirits. And so he has to become familiar with all aspects of both mental and physical illness. Still preceded by his guides, the candidate then came to the land of the shamanesses, who strengthened his throat and his voice. And so here we see the connection between the shaman and the voice. So often if not always, the shaman is somebody who chants and sings and drums. He was then carried to the shore of the 9 seas. In the middle of one of them was an island. So here we find the geography of the ocean. And so the ocean obviously has a great deal of symbolism in all the world's traditions. And so he's in the ocean. And there he comes upon an island. And in the middle of the island, a young birch tree rose to the sky. It was the tree of the Lord of the earth. So this symbolism of the tree, often understood as being at the center of the earth, is very ubiquitous in world traditions. I'm sure many of you will know about the tree of life in the Hebrew and Christian Bible. So this idea of a tree of life that grows from the center of the earth is very common. Beside it grew 9 herbs, the ancestors of all the plants on earth. Now, this idea of the shaman knowing about plants and herbs is also very important because shamans and healers often have to know about the healing and medicinal qualities found within plants. The tree was surrounded by seas, and in each of these swam a species of bird with its young. There were several kinds of ducks, a swan, and a sparrowhawk. The candidate visited all of these seas. Some of them were salt, others so hot you could not go near the shore. So I'll just skip ahead to where he's talking more about the tree. The Lord of the tree also gave branches to all the men who were in the top of the tree. But appearing from the tree up to the chest in human form, he added, "One branch only I give not to the shaman, for I keep it for the rest of mankind. They can make dwellings from it and so use it for their needs. I am the tree that gives life to all men." Clasping the branch, the candidate was ready to resume his flight when again he heard a human voice, this time revealing to him the medicinal virtues of the 7 plants and giving him certain instructions concerning the art of shamanizing. A very important practice connected to shamanism is the use of the drum. And so on page 10 in the vision, it says, again, we're talking about when he's in the tree of life. The branch had 3 forks, and the Lord of the tree bade him make 3 drums from it, to be kept by 3 women, each drum being for a special ceremony. The first for shamanizing women in childbirth, the second for curing the sick, and the third for finding men lost in the snow. And so the idea is that the drum itself is sacred. It's made from this sacred tree and has these healing qualities related to it. I find it very interesting. I read not too long ago that there was a case of, I think it was the United States, they were looking for somebody lost in the snow, and they actually, the police department, I believe it was, hired a shaman to try to help them locate the people. So we can see that the shaman fulfills a number of functions here by helping people in a variety of ways. The shaman also, certainly in indigenous cultures in North America, often also helps the group to find game, to find animals for hunting. And in this case, we see that they help women in childbirth and they heal the sick. We also find that the candidate has to move through the desert. And the idea of the desert as a spiritual space is, again, very common and probably familiar to many of you. So, for instance, we're told that Jesus spent 40 days in the desert, and the Prophet Muhammad received the revelation of the Quran in the desert. And so the idea of the desert as this spiritual space remains very important across a variety of cultures. In this account, the initiate moves through the desert until he sees a distant mountain. And again, mountains are associated with religion just about everywhere we look. Not hard to see why. I'm sure a number of you have been into the mountains. They're absolutely overwhelming. And there's also the idea of when you're up on a mountain, you have a very different view than what you do in the valley. And so this idea of being higher, closer to the gods, having a higher perspective. Certainly in Hinduism, it's believed that the gods live in the Himalayas, and so they're closer to heaven. In this next section that we find on page 10 and 11 of the course pack, we find an incident that I think can be a little bit, seem a bit strange to people. So we're told that he comes out of the desert, he sees the distant mountain, and he comes upon a naked man working a bellows. On the fire was a cauldron as big as half the earth. The naked man saw him and caught him with a huge pair of tongs. The novice had time to think, I am dead. The man cut off his head, chopped his body into bits, and put everything into the cauldron. There he boiled his body for 3 years. There were also 3 anvils, and the naked man forged the candidate's head on the third, which was the one on which the best shamans were forged. Then he threw the head into one of 3 pots that stood there, the one in which the water was the coldest. He now revealed to the candidate that when he was called to cure someone, if the water in the ritual pot was very hot, it would be useless to shamanize, for the man was already lost. If the water was warm, he was sick but could recover. Cold water denoted a healthy man. And so there's a number of ways of looking at this symbolism. Certainly it's a image of rebirth. So the person is being completely changed and transformed in this process and remade into a shaman. So there's the death and the rebirth, and it's obviously quite a violent process in this case. So his eyes have to be remade so that he or she can see mystically. His or her ears have to be remade so they can hear in a mystical way. We're also shown that these visions indicate the practices the shaman will be using. And so shamans possess a wide repertoire of rituals. And again, these vary across cultures. I've given some examples also in the lecture from the Navajo tradition. And so shamans often use dancing. They often wear masks and a variety of regalia. In some traditions, they dramatize the descent to the realm of the spirits. Shamans are almost always storytellers and well-versed in the stories and myths of their cultures, and they often act as dream interpreters. So on page 11 of the course pack, it continues, he forged his head and taught him now to read the letters that are inside it. He changed his eyes, and that is why when he shamanizes, he does not see with his bodily eyes, but with these mystical eyes. He pierced his ears, making him able to understand the language of plants. Then the candidate found himself on the summit of a mountain, and finally he awoke in his yurt. And we see above in the earlier quotation that he's told to procure 3 shamans' costumes. So once he's been resurrected, he has to dress differently. And I talk about this a lot in my ritual and ceremonies course, that the meaning of clothing, and I think in our culture we often don't take this very seriously, but it remains important even in our culture. And I remember going to a large religious studies conference years ago and seeing that I was dressed like everybody else there, and I hadn't even been aware of it. So we do wear forms of uniforms that indicate our professions. I'm sure you know that bankers dress a certain way, lawyers tend to dress a certain way. So we can see with shamans, their clothing sets them apart as ritual specialists and religious specialists. And this continues to this day, whether it's a priest or a nun or a monk, they're going to dress in a particular way that sets them apart. I want to end this presentation by looking at a phenomenon that started probably in the 70s and has only gained in popularity, and that is the emergence of what's been called Neo-shamanism. There tends to be an overlap between Neo-shamanism and paganism and Wicca, but not always. And I think this is a very interesting phenomenon, and certainly the work of people like Eliade seeded this movement. So we see, along with the revival of traditional practices in indigenous cultures, there's also been an interest outside of indigenous cultures in what's now called neo-shamanism. Now, while there is much that can be the subject of satire in neo-shamanism, and certainly, I don't know if any of you saw the supposed quote-unquote QAnon shaman that was part of the group that tried to take over the government on Capitol Hill. He called himself a shaman. I don't know what he thought he meant by that, but anyway. So it's rife for satire. It's also, on a more serious note, has been accused of cultural appropriation. But I think it is interesting to look at the fact that I think people genuinely see shamanism as a bridge into things like creating a different relationship with the natural world and with animals, and also as a form of healing. I'm not sure how many of you will have attended a powwow, probably a lot of you. And the one I attended at Nipissing, I was told that the drum, which is at the center of the powwow, is the heartbeat of Mother Earth. And in the lectures for this week on neo-shamanism, you'll see that a number of counselors, social workers, psychotherapists have taken up this idea of using drumming as a way to help people heal from things like drug and substance addiction. So it's interesting to look at the ways in which there's a recognition that comes right back from shamanism that sound profoundly impacts human beings, and there have been multiple studies now showing the ways in which sound impacts our feeling of well-being and our emotional state. And it's also important to note that for many people, so for instance, a number of these neo-shamans work with young men, that talk therapy is probably not going to work very well with young men, especially in a culture, our culture tells men that they shouldn't talk about their feelings, so talk therapy may not be very useful. So, especially adolescent boys. So there's been a lot of success in using drumming and chanting and various techniques from shamanism to work with young boys who are coming out of traumatic events or at work with addiction.